It was a quiet Tuesday morning in the suburban neighborhood of Maplewood, the kind of day where nothing ever seemed to happen. Birds chirped lazily in the trees, and the faint hum of lawnmowers echoed in the distance. But all that peace was about to be shattered by a single phone call, a call that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Karen, a woman known to everyone on the block for her sharp tongue and even sharper opinions, stood at her living room window, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her eyes were locked on the scene unfolding across the street. A black man, Marcus, was building a fence along his driveway. To most people, it was just a simple home improvement project. But to Karen, it was something else entirely. Something suspicious. Something that in her mind warranted a call to 911. "Hello, yes, I need to report something," Karen said, her voice trembling with a mix of urgency and indignation. "There's a man outside and he's building something. I don't know what he's up to, but it doesn't look right. Could you send someone to check it out?" The dispatcher on the other end tried to calm her down, asking for more details. But Karen was already convinced she was witnessing something nefarious. She didn't know Marcus well. He had only moved into the neighborhood a few months ago, but she had already formed her own opinions about him. And now, as she watched him hammering away at the fence posts, she was sure he was up to no good. What Karen didn't know was that Marcus had a plan. A big one. He wasn't just building a fence. He was creating something that would change the entire dynamic of the neighborhood, but he wasn't doing it out of malice or spite. In fact, his intentions were the exact opposite. Marcus had always been a man of action, someone who believed in solving problems rather than complaining about them. And the problem he saw in Maplewood was one that had been bothering him for a while. The lack of community. People kept to themselves, doors stayed shut, and conversations rarely went beyond a polite nod or a quick hello. Marcus wanted to change that. He wanted to bring people together to create a space where neighbors could connect and build relationships. And the fence? Well, it was just the first step in his grand plan, but Karen didn't know any of that. All she saw was a man she didn't trust doing something she didn't understand. And as she waited for the police to arrive, her mind raced with possibilities. Was he building a fence to keep people out? Or was it something more sinister? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Meanwhile, Marcus continued working, completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few yards away. He was focused on his vision, on the hope that this small project could make a big difference. But as the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, it was clear that his plan was about to face its first major obstacle. The police car pulled up to the curb, and two officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. Karen rushed out to meet them, pointing frantically at Marcus. "That's him," she said, her voice rising. "He's the one I called about. I don't know what he's doing, but it doesn't look right." The officers exchanged a glance, then approached Marcus, who had stopped working and was now watching them with a puzzled look on his face. "Everything okay here?" one of the officers asked, his tone neutral but firm. Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. "Yeah, everything's fine, just building a fence. Is there a problem?" The tension in the air was palpable. Karen stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, waiting for the officers to take action. Marcus, meanwhile, was trying to figure out why the police were even there. He had no idea that his simple act of building a fence had sparked such a dramatic response. As the officers began to question him, Marcus realized that this was about more than just a fence. It was about assumptions, about fear, about the way people see each other or don't see each other in a world that often feels divided. And as he stood there trying to explain himself, he couldn't help but wonder, would his plan to bring the neighborhood together be doomed before it even began? But this was only the beginning. As the officers continued their questioning, and Karen watched from the sidelines, something unexpected happened. A few other neighbors, curious about the commotion, began to gather. They stood at a distance, whispering to each other, their eyes darting between Marcus, Karen, and the police. It was a moment that would change everything, for Marcus, for Karen, and for the entire neighborhood, because what happened next would reveal more than anyone could have anticipated. Secrets would come to light, Tensions would rise and the true nature of the community would be put to the test. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the street, one thing was certain: nothing in Maplewood would ever be the same again. But what exactly was Marcus planning? Why was Karen so quick to call the police? And how would the rest of the neighborhood react when they found out the truth? The answers to these questions would unfold in ways no one could have predicted. And as the story continued, it would become clear that this wasn't just about offense. It was about trust, about understanding, and about the power of one person to make a difference, even in the face of fear and misunderstanding. So stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. What happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat, wondering how it will all end. As the officers continued their conversation with Marcus, the small crowd of neighbors grew larger. People who had been inside their homes minding their own business now found themselves drawn to the scene by the flashing lights of the police car and the unusual sight of Marcus standing in his driveway, tools in hand, being questioned. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived in Maplewood for over 30 years. She was known for her kindness and her ability to see the best in people, even when others couldn't. She stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the scene unfold with a thoughtful expression. Next to her was Jake, a high school student who spent most of his time skateboarding around the neighborhood. He looked both curious and uneasy, as if he wasn't sure whether he should stay or leave. And then there was Lisa, a single mom who had moved to Maplewood a year ago in search of a safer, quieter place to raise her young daughter. She stood a little further back, holding her daughter's hand, her eyes darting between Marcus and Karen, trying to make sense of what was happening. Karen, for her part, was growing more impatient by the minute. She had expected the police to take immediate action, to question Marcus more aggressively, or even to ask him to stop whatever he was doing. But instead, the officers seemed calm, almost too calm for her liking. "Why aren't they doing anything?" she muttered under her breath, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. She glanced around at the gathering crowd, half expecting someone to back her up, to agree with her that something was wrong. But no one said a word. They just watched, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Marcus, meanwhile, was doing his best to stay calm. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but being questioned by the police in front of his neighbors was not how he had envisioned his day going. "I'm just building a fence," he explained again, his voice steady, but firm. "I got all the necessary permits from the city. You can check if you want." The officers nodded, jotting down notes, but they didn't seem in any hurry to leave. One of them, Officer Ramirez, glanced over at the partially built fence and then back at Marcus. "Mind if we take a look around?" he asked. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Sure, go ahead. But like I said, it's just a fence." As the officers began to inspect the area, Karen took a step closer, her eyes narrowing as she watched them. She was convinced they would find something, anything, that would prove her suspicions right. But as the minutes passed and the officers found nothing out of the ordinary, her frustration grew. "Are you sure you're checking everything?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. Officer Ramirez turned to her, his expression calm but firm. "Ma'am, we're doing our job. If there's something to find, we'll find it. But so far, everything seems to be in order." The crowd of neighbors began to murmur among themselves, some of them shooting curious glances at Karen. Mrs. Thompson, ever the peacemaker, stepped forward. "Karen, maybe we should let the officers do their work," she said gently. "I'm sure Marcus isn't doing anything wrong. He's just trying to improve his property like any of us would." Karen shot her a sharp look. "You don't know that," she snapped. "You don't know what he's capable of." Mrs. Thompson sighed but didn't argue. She knew better than to engage when Karen was in one of her moods. Meanwhile, Marcus was starting to feel the weight of the situation. He had moved to Maplewood hoping for a fresh start, a place where he could put down roots and be part of a community. But now, standing there in front of his neighbors, being questioned by the police, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. He glanced around at the faces in the crowd, searching for some sign of support, but most people avoided his gaze. Only Jake, the high school student, gave him a small nod as if to say, "Hang in there." As the officers finished their inspection and began to wrap up, Officer Ramirez turned to Marcus. "Everything looks fine," he said. "But if you don't mind, we'd like to take a look at those permits you mentioned, just to be thorough." Marcus nodded, relieved that the situation seemed to be winding down. "Sure, I'll get them for you," he said, heading inside to retrieve the documents. As he disappeared into the house, Karen let out a frustrated sigh. "This isn't over," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. But the crowd was starting to disperse, the excitement of the moment fading as people realized there was nothing more to see. Lisa, the single mom, lingered for a moment, her daughter tugging at her hand. "Come on, Mommy, let's go," the little girl said, clearly bored with the whole thing. But Lisa hesitated, her eyes still on Marcus's house. She had seen the way Karen had reacted, the way she had jumped to conclusions without knowing the full story. It reminded her of something she had experienced herself not long after moving to Maplewood. She had been at the park with her daughter when a woman had approached her, asking if she needed help. At first, Lisa had thought the woman was being kind, but then she realized the woman had assumed she was the nanny, not the mother. It had been a small moment, but it had stayed with her, a reminder that not everyone saw her the way she saw herself. As Marcus returned with the permits and handed them to the officers, Lisa made a decision. She walked over to him, her daughter, trailing behind her. "Hey," she said softly, catching his attention. Marcus looked up, surprised. "Hi," he replied, his tone cautious but polite. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about all this," Lisa continued, gesturing to the police car in the now mostly empty street. "It's not fair." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," he said. "I appreciate that." But as Lisa and her daughter walked away, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Karen's call to the police had stirred something in the neighborhood, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. And as he looked at the half-built fence, he realized that his plan to bring the community together might be more complicated than he had thought. Because while he had been focused on building something positive, someone else had been busy building walls. Walls of fear, of suspicion, of misunderstanding. And as the sun set over Maplewood, casting long shadows over the quiet streets, Marcus couldn't help but wonder, would his fence be enough to bridge the divide, or would it only make things worse? The answers to those questions were still unclear, but one thing was certain: the story was far from over. And as the night settled in, the tension in the air was almost palpable, a quiet reminder that in a neighborhood where everyone kept to themselves, even the smallest actions could have the biggest consequences.